I'm delighted to be here because I am a Melbourne son, even though I don't live in Australia now. I'm a Melbourne boy, so it's always good to be back. And it's good to be talking to reps from local councils, because in many respects, in terms of the 3 tiers of government in Australia, over the next decade or so, you're going to become far more important in the community's eyes than probably the Commonwealth government. Governments all around, state governments all around the world, I mean national governments all around the world, have been sucked into a situation where they increasingly can't deliver on what we expect of them for various reasons. The most important reason being that the invention of the nation state was to compete against other nation states. And so in an era when we need to collaborate far more effectively with each other to deal with some of the major issues of our time, the nation state finds itself in a situation where it doesn't know how to do that. And no better example exists than the Rio +20 just recently. There were over 25,000 official representatives of nation states in Rio trying to arrive at a consensus about how to deal with climate change. That's stupid. I mean, it really is stupid. I reckon if we took a major issue in this room that affected you, let's say, for example, the kind of unwritten assumption that's existed for about 100 years in Australia about local councils. One of those is that the underlying strategy is for a council of difficulty is either administration or amalgamation. Let's take that as an issue. I reckon if we try to reach consensus about a future strategy on those two things, in this room, with just this number of people, we wouldn't be able to do it. If we stayed here for a week, we probably wouldn't be able to do it. So 25,000 people, it's not going to arrive at a consensus. So the nation state governments all around the world are suffering because of that. I wanted to start off by framing for you the future of work. 10 years ago, social networks didn't exist. I hadn't even thought of it. 10 years before that, the World Wide Web didn't exist. I don't know if any of you, some of you are as old as me, or nearly, remember those first clunky mobile phones that came out, the bricks. I remember living in Sydney at the time, and I was the driveway to our home in Carlingford was a slope, and I put this massive great mobile phone from Nokia, one of the first from Nokia, on the car roof and backed over it. And, I always remember that. And now, of course, they're so small and contain so many different apps. So today, if you're working today in mobile telecommunications or web design or anything like that, your job didn't exist 5-6 years ago. So in terms of the future of work, it's an interesting question to try to understand what jobs will exist in 10 years' time. And nobody knows. It's something we can't predict. However, we can anticipate more accurately the evolution of work in terms of the kinds of skills we might need, the kind of ways we will be working, who we'll be working with, what the workplace will look like. And we can do that sometimes quite accurately. The speed of technological change is exponential. And there's no doubt these days that technological change and innovation is driving a lot of what we're going to be doing in the next 5 to 10 years. There's no getting away from it. There are other drivers, and they're quite subtle in a way, and their interaction is what interests me more than anything. But technology is a major driver, there's no doubt about that. As we speak, too, there is a schism opening up between The old world that we live in today, still in Australia, still in terms of Melbourne, we live in an age of what I refer to as industrial economism. If you look at TV or look at the Financial Review or read the papers, apart from the headlines around Gina Reinhardt, but you go below that, and everything in some form or other is to do with the economy and industry. Very, very interesting that if you look at the economic complexity atlas of the world today, Australia ranks around 87th out of about 123 nations in terms of the embedded productive knowledge in the workforce. That's pretty awful. That effectively says we know how to shear sheep and dig holes. If you compare us with the country where I live at the moment, Thailand, where you would think, if you don't know, you would think, well, that's a third world country in Asia. Thailand, in terms of economic complexity, ranks number 3 in the world behind China and India. In other words, the diversity and richness of embedded productive knowledge in that economy is incredible. Admittedly, there is a population 3 times the size of Australia. Nevertheless, Asian countries are where investors will now look to invest. And in fact, what a real problem for Australia at the moment is the fact that investment is flowing out of Australia, not in. So that's an interesting proposition. But the major schism that's taking place is between this age of industrial economism here, where we're still thinking very much in old terms of what manufacturing, how work happens, how we shop, how we spend our money, in other words, how we save, compared with almost a parallel universe that I work in, which is moving to a situation where there are many, many more individuals and groups not waiting for permission from government, not waiting for funding for government to actually do what needs to be done in their sphere of influence, in their world, to move into areas of competence and expertise and difference that is more around business ecosystems, more around entrepreneurship, more around collaboration rather than competition. And it's, in a sense, it's weird coming back, because I'm in the country every 5 or 6 weeks. It's weird coming back and stepping off the plane into this world which I know so well. I'm so literate as an Australian about being Australian. And yet it seems dislocated from a great deal that's happening around the world today. And so one of the things I want to do is to try and give you a really strong sense of what those things are, at least some of them, related to, first of all, the council, the value a council brings to the community. Secondly, the kind of workforce a council will be moving towards over the next 5 to 10 years. And thirdly, the individual worker, if you like, the skills and knowledge and expertise that we will need in order to be able to work effectively in that situation. Most important thing to understand is that, I've already said, it's difficult to be specific about what jobs will exist because we really don't know. The speed of technology is exponential. But what is more important than that is the consciousness around work. The Industrial Revolution that ushered in this age of consumerism, market consumerism, altered the workers' consciousness about what was important and how work should be done, particularly moving, of course, to the mass market. And we rewired our brains into really thinking about how we could consume more, how we could create wealth, how we could own property, and that didn't exist before that revolution. And there are a number of commentators today pointing out that we're heading fast into a third industrial revolution. If you want to know more about the detail of what the leading thinkers around this are saying, and Mike McCallum is going to be a colleague of mine, might be talking about this tomorrow, but go to a guy called Jeremy Rifkin, R-I-F-K-I-N, who's written a book, Third Industrial Revolution, which will give you a fairly accurate idea of what this new revolution is going to be like, just in terms of dealing with things like waste and inefficiency and energy consumption and the kind of skills that the workforce will need. So what I'm interested in particularly is this working consciousness. What are the things that current and future employees will be taking notice of? And how will those things transform what we're doing today into something quite different? And I believe that you've started to talk about transformation. And very often transformation is spoken about quite glibly. It's the same, well, it's about change, isn't it? Well, no, it's about fundamental change. Transformation is about replacing many of the assumptions we have today with other assumptions that are very different. And I have personally believed that certainly within your lifetimes, the whole rationale of work is going to be transformed, possibly unrecognisably. In terms of the Asian Foresight Institute, we've done a bit of research and exploration into possible futures for work, and we've reached three conclusions that you should know as a general framework. The first is that the future is likely to be less about general skills and much more about personal mastery in the area of social networking, collaboration, mastering complexity, strategic innovation, much more driven by individual energy and initiative and a willingness to work in very often virtual teams, at a scale which is global and at a speed which is breathtaking, astonishing. The second thing we believe is going to change dramatically is that the future of work will be less about working as competitive, isolated individuals and more about working collaboratively in what is becoming an intimately entangled world, which you can see through social networks like Facebook, for example. Although Facebook won't be around in 10 years' time, I would suggest. And the future also thirdly, is going to be less about focusing solely on standards of living and much more about the quality of experiences. The experience of work, the experience of life, and the experience that you get when you buy something. Even now, I talk about the economy globally as being an experience economy. We're kind of moving up the value chain where commodities, generally speaking, are not interesting to people in business any longer. And all the new businesses, especially the online businesses, funnily enough, because they're without the high touch that usually comes from personal interaction. But a lot of the new online businesses are aiming to provide experiences which are unique, personalized, and very, very different from what has existed in the past. So if the global economy is moving to an experience economy, the nature of experience matters. And we can see how, at the moment, how that affects major companies in Australia, like Qantas, for example, that don't understand. Qantas basically has lost the plot in terms of understanding what buying an experience means, whereas both Emirates and Etihad understand. If you've travelled recently in both of those airlines and you can compare the two, you'll understand what I mean. So that's a kind of frame. Excuse me, I need some water. I normally pace. I don't like standing behind a lectern, so Normally getting water during the talk doesn't matter so much, but when you have to leave the mic, it matters. Please excuse me. So, in this world, what's important, what's happening, what should we take notice of? As I said, I think the first important thing is to understand that we're in an age of transition. We're moving away from that, the phrase I used is industrial economism, to an age which is going to be much more around entrepreneurship and management and stewardship of ecosystems, both natural, business and personal. When I was born, there were 1.82 billion people on the planet. And now there are 7 billion people on the planet. By 2050, if we extrapolate that figure, and it might change, I mean, it might not get as bad as we think at the moment because there are certain factors beginning to impact population globally that could cause the population actually to collapse rather than to increase. But, and one of those is climate change. But at the moment we're destined to hit about 9.1 billion people by the year 2050. Now, when in 1945, when there were 1.8 billion people on the planet could exist, given its resources and given the demands we were making on those resources, quite comfortably. Today, with 7 billion people, all interconnected, all looking at each other's quality of life, all understanding what others have and we don't, wherever you are in the world, it creates a kind of difficulty and puts huge pressure on the systems we have purposefully designed to deliver what we need. The systems like food production, for example, if you look into food and look at does everyone here shop? I know a lot of men sometimes don't. Do you go into a supermarket and know what the price of margarine is? Yeah? You'll notice that the price of food, even in a country like Australia, is actually escalating. I was astonished the other day. I went into one of my local supermarkets, which has a huge array of organic stuff, and usually the organic vegetables and fruit in Thailand are more or less the same price as a lot of imported stuff, and actually quite reasonable to buy. The price has increased in organic lettuces and other vegetables generally by about 12.5% this year, and it's still going up. The system we've designed, which has a huge influence from major corporations, just a few major corporations in the world, who actually control the food chain and what we eat and what we drink, is basically unsustainable. So the cost of food is going to get more and more expensive. And hopefully we'll begin to see in a country like Australia more growers' markets and locally grown food being more accessible to urban city dwellers. The energy crisis is extraordinary. I mean, in a country like Australia, the level of debate about energy is as unsophisticated as it comes. I guess because there are so many vested interests in mining coal, which should be left in the ground if at all possible. But we're going to feel the impacts of those stupid policies and lack of insight and lack of foresight over the next 5 to 10 years. I was saying to Mike on the way down from Bangkok the other night, I took the overnight flight, and I do a lot of flying all the time. I clock up about 100 hours on an aeroplane every month, sometimes much more. And I had never experienced the kind of turbulence from an extreme weather pattern basically from south of Singapore for about 2 or 3 hours. Most pilots will tell you that turbulence, you suffer for about 15-20 minutes. This went on for 3 hours and I couldn't get to sleep. Extreme weather events around the world are an indication that the climate is collapsing. Again, it's pressure from so many people demanding so much of the planet. Now, this would be okay if we all wanted to live like the average Indian in the subcontinent, in a place like Calcutta. Because if that was the case, we could probably support a global population of about 17 billion people. However, most of us want to live, and I think it's absolutely crazy, but most of us want to live like the average American, with at least 2 or 3 cars and that kind of quality of life, although I have no understanding why we would want to be so obese. Nevertheless, around the world, America is still the kind of desired land of opportunity. And if we all were living like the average American does, even today, where there's a great deal of poverty in America now, we could support a population probably of about 2.5 billion people. We're already at 7. So we're getting through the resources extremely quickly. The system of energy is very interesting because a lot of people don't realize that the energy we use in computing, for example, follows Moore's law. Now, Moore's law, as you probably know, you've heard of Moore's law? The computing power of a computer doubles roughly every 18 months. Have you heard of that? Which is true, it's maintained itself so far. What we never talk about is the energy efficiency of computers. If you actually put in your computer today, this thing here, this PC, or your iPad, if you put a computer battery from 1991, which is not so long ago, into your computer today, the full battery would last 2.5 seconds. 2.5 seconds. That's how far battery power efficiency has come. And we're moving to a situation now which is going to impact you, where new devices are not needing batteries at all because they're working on ambient energy. So stray signals picked up from light, for example, or sunlight, or television or radio signals, which are all the energy that is needed in some of the new sensors and computers being used today, developed today, being commercialized today. Just think how much nano data that is going to release. So the amount, when we talk about knowledge management, the knowledge or the information we've had to deal with in the past is nothing compared with the vast volumes we will be able to access individually all the time within 5 to 10 years. So if you're worrying about managing the information you have today, and if you come from records management, you're going to have to think again, because records management will not exist as it exists today. This is why you're talking, I presume, about transformation, because the whole nature of the stress on the systems and the technology changes that are coming in are going to change things fundamentally. There's one other aspect that is important to understand. It's the aspect of the result of interconnectedness of people. When you have people in Soweto, in South Africa, or in some of the poorest parts of Brazil or Argentina, or in Southeast Asia, and they are able to, they have televisions, they're able to look at the programs from Australia, the UK, and the US and see how other people live. They are all wanting the same as we have got today. And it's very difficult, ethically and morally, to deny them that opportunity. But if they succeed, the pressure on the systems that I mentioned at the moment and more are going to be extraordinary. They're just going to collapse. Well, the systems that I've mentioned at the moment are in a state of early collapse. The energy system is in a state of early collapse, and we know we're going to have to move very swiftly to a renewable basis. Now that's very, very difficult. If you look at everything in this room, literally everything apart from your bodies, everything that you're wearing, everything that's on the table, the furniture, the carpet, the building materials, everything comes from oil. And we are totally addicted to oil and gas. In Australia, we're addicted to coal as well because it's a good export for us, a good money earner. As I've already mentioned, coal should stay in the ground. It is as toxic as anything else in the earth. And we can't afford to actually dig it up. So we've got to move the energy system, we've got to move the food system. The health and welfare system is going to change dramatically. The education system is going to be turned upside down. Financial services, as exactly the same, turned upside down. And when you're thinking of something you have very close affiliation with, which is something like emergency management services, for example, with local councils, that is going to become such a priority for you in the future, given that there's so much political inaction around the issue of climate change, that we're already locked in to emergency services being increasingly important over the next decade. It's just going to get the need for emergency services and dealing differently with communities in terms of emergencies is going to change dramatically. So all of this means that those three areas I mentioned earlier are going to transform radically. So let's look at the value proposition that local councils bring to the community. How can we begin to rethink the value of the council ecosystem in terms of local government? How can we take into account the fact that the experience economy is real, urbanisation is real, and delivery of services is going to become absolutely critical for every community? How can we think about it in an era where people are beginning to awaken much more to the injustices and inequities that exist all around us? Where we see people actually getting up in Wall Street and saying, enough is enough, I'm actually fed up and no longer want to put up with the fact that an average CEO in America, as epitomised by banks like Goldman Sachs, for example, gets around 400 times the average worker. Now, in the past, we've been very compliant about not particularly worrying about those kinds of things. But now we feel that is such an injustice that we're going to do something about it. Communities all around the world are rising up against, but I will say the elite, the establishment if you like, but those people that have designed the systems that we use today and which we take for granted. This is why I think we're in this transitional time between one kind of social reality and an entirely different kind of social reality. And in that context, what does the council become? What value do you create? The real value is going to be, I believe, in participative and interactive democracy, where people want much more of a say in what they do. One of the problems in Australia is, and we've heard this so many times just recently, the tendency has been to become a nanny state, where we try to regulate people's lives. I was noticing yesterday on the first I heard about it, about this basics card that has been bought in certain parts of the country, I understand, where people who do not have work or have problems or difficulties getting work are given a card so that they can't buy alcohol with the money they get. They can't buy cigarettes, they can't buy drugs, etc., etc., etc. And one has to ask to what extent the state, whether it's Commonwealth, state, or local government, is prepared to regulate, interfere in people's lives, intervene in people's lives. The real value, I think, for councils in the future is that interactive nature, that partnership with the community, where the council actually acts as an enabler of community desires and needs much more effectively than they do today. So the value is going to be in social capital, in connecting with people, in social networks, and in relationships. That is something that means high touch. It'll be high tech, but high touch. The value of relationships is going to become more and more important as we move into the future. Another thing I think that councils will start realizing they need to do is forming relationships with not just other councils in the same country, but other councils, other regions, other cities around the world. We can do this quite easily now, and it's not being done in the area of how we can be more effective or efficient. I think that's going to happen very, very quickly. One of the difficulties that the technology revolution gives us, of course, is the issue of both security and privacy. And there are a number of views on how that will develop into the future. My own view is that we just need to get over it, and that privacy is a 19th century kind of view. This is very provocative, and to say this in government circles is extremely provocative, but I just think that's one of the assumptions that's going to change over the next decade or two, that we're going to be far more accepting of people understanding and relating and communicating with us quite transparently, quite openly, and expecting that authenticity to be publicly available. The council also everywhere needs to think about how it innovates, how it does more with less, how it improves everything it does, and a lot of that is going to be through outsourcing. That trend is going to be continued in the technological context in terms of crowdsourcing. If you don't understand crowdsourcing, you perhaps should, because that in many respects is going to be where the competition is coming from. Just recently I launched an appeal. I have a foundation in Thailand, and I wanted to get it funded, and I approached a few friends and my own network and didn't get very far. I wanted about 6,000 Australian dollars, not very much, for this appeal. And, well, not for me, by the way, for something else entirely different. But that didn't work, and so I went to a crowdfunding site called Indiegogo. Has anyone heard of Indiegogo here? Yeah, some of you. Basically, you can launch without cost, you can launch your own appeal or project or assignment that you want to get funding for. Perhaps it's a movie, perhaps it's some kind of local community initiative. And you can find, from the crowd globally on the internet, you can find potential sources for funding very effectively and very quickly. So the whole notion of funding coming from just one sector is disappearing. All the boundaries are disappearing. And finally, every council needs to understand that you will be working in a world, in fact you are today, of derived demand. That's a very, very interesting proposition. This room has windows which lets in light, but if it didn't, if it was just a concrete bunker, your need for light would be instant as soon as you came into the room. That's a derived demand. Now, we fulfill derived demands with electricity by flicking a switch, and it's immediately on. If you think of financial services today, and the time you have to wait for approval to get a mortgage, for example, that is it's already collapsing into nothing. The cost will collapse into nothing as well. So derived demands means the speed of what you do. Every transaction, every interaction, every adaptation required of you will need to be much faster. Speed is of the essence. So in terms of the council, generally speaking, councils will transform to be more in partnership with the local community. They will be focused much more on relationships. They will not be so hung up on records management as has been in the past, because all of that will be available without the need for human intervention. It will be available all the time. That information, that knowledge will be available online all the time in the cloud. Again, if you don't know what cloud technology, I should say, it's moving files from computers into virtual space. And the capacity for doing that is escalating out of hand. So that's the council. That is transformation in itself. What about the worker? What about council workers working in local government? I believe this is probably one of the most fundamental and far-reaching aspects of transformation over the next decade. By the way, as a futurist, I would normally talk out 50 to 100 years. I'm not. In your context, I'm deliberately saying the next decade. So we're only talking 5 to 10 years. The workforce in local councils will be transformed again around relationship. If you look at some of the most successful businesses in the world today, not necessarily the major corporations, although they're slowly moving that way, but the more successful small to medium enterprises that exist all around the world, and again, not necessarily in Australia, but looking at the leaders in the field, you have to look at companies like Zappos, headquartered in Las Vegas, for example, where the whole structure of the company and the whole ethos of the company is based on relationships, and the social fabric is one of family, essentially is one of family, so that they don't just, workers in Zappos don't just work together, they play together as well. There's even a mandate that managers should spend a certain amount of their time socially with other people in the company. It's harder to be employed by Zappos than it is to get into Harvard as a student. It's really difficult. Why? Because once you're in, people don't want to leave. And they, in order to get you in, I mean, they have many people who want to work for Zappos. It's just an online, started selling shoes online. It's an online shopping mall. If you don't know it, Zappos. But it's an extraordinary culture. I'm almost tempted to say cult. The culture is so familial, it's so intimate, it's so intense that if you walk into Zappos, it's like, and you've never been there before, it's like walking into a kind of Alice in Wonderland business where everyone's on acid. The noise, the buzz, the energy is just extraordinary. A couple of years ago, I took 19 executives from NAB around the world on a learning journey. And they wanted to go to Disney, so okay, we went to Disney. But then I took them to Zappos in Las Vegas. And we spent a day there. And they came out and the jaws had hit the ground because they just couldn't believe it. The guy who runs the NAB call centers here went into the call center in Zappos, and you've got, people dressed not as formally as myself, lounging around. The workplace is littered with the way they want to, arrange their desks. It's all open plan, of course. There are no scripts, as you usually get with call centres. There's no mandate about the time you spend talking to a customer. In fact, there's a great story at Zappos that they got a call from a woman, a customer in New York at 3 o'clock in the morning one day, and she wanted to buy a pizza. And the worker at Zappos explained that they don't sell pizzas. And this woman in New York said, yeah, but I can't get out. And last time you were so good to me, and you delivered these things for me. And surely you could do something to help me. And after about 3 hours talking, she got a pizza in New York. They do extraordinary things in Zappos. Sorry if I'm going on about Zappos. I'm trying to give you a feel for what the workforce of councils in the future might feel like. When you do training, you come to Zappos and you're accepted as an employee or potential employee. The training is 4 weeks. It doesn't matter whether you're the next CEO or you're in the call centre. It's 4 weeks, and it's really an induction into the ethos and the culture of the company. And what's important is the experience, the customer experience, customer intimacy. And then after the 4 weeks training, the HR director will come up to you and offer you $2,500 to leave. No problems, you're now employable in this kind of environment. If you don't want to work here, that's fine, take the money and run. No obligation. Most people don't. What they don't know is after another 3 weeks on the job, the HR director will come up to them again and say, okay, you didn't want $2,500, it's $4,000 to leave. Now, In an environment, in Las Vegas today, Las Vegas is one of the areas in the US really hit by the subprime mortgage crisis. You've got row upon row, street upon street of houses up for sale. And it's extraordinary, the level of poverty outside of the CBD, outside of the glitter in Las Vegas. You offer people who've done 4 weeks of training, and 3 weeks on the job, $4,000 to leave. You'd think that a lot of them would opt for that. Less than 1%. That's why the culture is so thick. It's just an example of how friendship, the whole notion of familiarity, intimacy, friendship, and the guild-like nature of communities is going to infect council workforces. Working for a council in 10 years' time, I believe, will feel very much like that. I mentioned mastery. In terms of the individuals who are going to be making up the workforce, we will need to have mastery in terms of flexibility, being able to stand in another person's shoes with empathy, being freelance, if you like, being collaborative, being creative, being highly literate in complex problems and complex problem solving. And the workforce is going to have to compete, as I've suggested, in terms of crowdsourcing. The workforce will need to compete with the crowd, the intelligent crowd. So the competition isn't necessarily from the next council, the council down the road, or from people just as individuals. It will come from the global workplace. I've already mentioned derived demand. It's very important to understand that in terms of council workers, the term career is as outdated as the word typewriter. It really is. You're going to have to work for it in the future. And the leadership of the council will be interesting. I think that's going to change dramatically. I don't see the current structures lasting because I don't think the whole nature of the council appointing elected councillors appointing a CEO and the CEO appointing the workforce, I think is something itself that's going to go out of the window. And we can think about this in a minute because I want to leave time for questions. But the new leadership literacies in councils will be around transdisciplinary knowledge and systemic design, primarily, design of whole systems. This is very important, a departure, because we are educated to think in very linear reductionist terms. We allocate jobs in that way. We divide it up into, even in the Commonwealth government and state governments, we get these portfolios where a minister sits above a particular portfolio, and we get even competition between the portfolios. We'll move away from that because working in silos simply isn't going to be attractive for the community. It's not going to be able to work to deliver for you what you need to deliver. So the worker is going to become much more interdependent. There will be fewer of them, no doubt, and you will be competing internationally, globally. And you will need to be a master of so many different things. So we come to the work, finally. What will the work be? Very difficult question to answer, but I do believe operations will need to be rewired, and this is where the consciousness of work comes in. As people awaken around the world to a different reality, the reality that the way we have been living our lives is not sustainable in the long term, and we need to shift our assumptions quite fundamentally to a different way of living and experiencing our lives together. The whole nature of work enabled by technology is going to transform. What becomes very apparent, and what I've been talking to Telstra about for a long time, is the shift which is happening now, enabled by technologies that exist today, to move from places to spaces. It's not where you work that will be important. You can work from anywhere. This, of course, was true a few years ago. I remember it was 16 years ago, I was working in the Australian Tax Office with the then Commissioner, Michael Carmody, and we were having a leadership team meeting, and 2 or 3 people were Skyping in or video conferencing in, and one in particular was a Skype, and this guy had answered a question which was a bit weird, and we thought, hang on, where are you? And there was silence, and then Michael Carmody said, Tim, where are you? And there was silence, and then Tim said quite sheepishly, but actually I'm on my boat in the Whitsunday Passage. So even then, 16 years ago, but today and into the future, where we work is going to be of no consequence. A lot of the work that's done today, and increasingly, will be done from anywhere. If you've got one of these, and you've got mobile telephone, because of the convergence of technology and the speed of interconnection these days, you'll be able to do what you do today from anywhere, literally. You probably can today if you look into it. Location doesn't matter. It's embedded technologies like the cloud that enable that. That means, of course, that productivity becomes absolutely transparent. It means that it's possible to eliminate waste. One of the things that I mentioned in passing, this notion of a third industrial revolution, is a revolution in manufacturing, where we start using 3D printers on a commercial scale to print everything, depending on what you feed in as the raw material, to print everything from desks and chairs to food and perhaps even buildings in the future. And it's called additive manufacturing, and it means there's no waste. You actually are creating you're building up, you're growing, rather than taking away, using raw materials that you then need to shape and cast, and you have waste being thrown away. So the whole notion of productivity in councils also becomes like that. There will be less and less waste until such time as there is absolutely no waste at all. And if you are working in a process where there is waste, actually that'll be redundant. The whole process will become redundant. I believe project teams, which are quite important now, and virtual teams, which are becoming more important, where not only can you work from anywhere, but you can work with other people who work everywhere. Virtual teams is the most common form of working in an organisation today. I believe those teams will change as well. I believe the work will become more like products and projects, rather like the Hollywood movie industry, or the movie industry even in Australia, where whole teams of people come together for a particular project, do their thing, and then go away. And you might come to work with those people again or not. It depends. So the thing that's going to impact that, of course, is the whole approach to open source innovation, peer-to-peer working, and I guess those things will demolish the kind of boundaries, or the boundaries that currently exist. Ultimately, I guess what we're talking about here is integral design, the design of whole systems that offer the community a way of interacting with councils, with government, that hadn't been offered before, at a level of intimacy and relationship that is absolutely fundamental to the changes that are happening elsewhere in the world. So if I can just sum up, and then we can talk about this and I'll ask a few questions. This time, isn't it? Yes. We're in an age of transition. We're moving from an age of industrial economism where we are comfortable, we have certain assumptions about the role of councils and how we deliver services to the community, and we're moving to a situation in the future where many of those assumptions will need to change. We will need to examine almost everything in terms of what we do and how we do it. The future is also very exciting because for the first time we're able to really change human destiny.